Hello everyone, today I'm bringing you a video talking about this. This is the 1950 pattern bush jacket. We're also going to be talking about the trousers as well. And this is the jungle green uniform that the British Army adopted essentially as standard from the mid 90s, well, it certainly became standard from the mid 1950s onwards. And would be worn right the way through into the 1970s when the tropical combat uniform came into service in the various interesting shades of DPM that it was seen printed in. There was an interim design, which we'll talk a little bit more about as we get through the video. Essentially, this was a new uniform introduced to replace, well, initially supplement, but then the idea was, of course, to replace the various designs of jungle uniform, which had been introduced in the latter years of the Second World War, or certainly designed in the latter years of the Second World War and immediate post-war, and the Indian jungle green clothing, which was still being worn in the early 1950s. And it shows certain elements which you could sort of ascribe to return to the idea of peacetime soldiering. It's quite a smart uniform. It has the potential to be. This is a little bit creased up from being in the box, but pressed and starched, it's quite a nice, smart uniform. Obviously, it has an integral waist belt here, as you can see, scalloped pockets. Considering the British Army was still involved in the fighting in Malaya at this time, it seems a little bit odd to have an integral waist belt, and a little bit odd that sort of you can see the design elements have definitely been there's been a lot of thought into putting into making this look smart as opposed to perhaps being a practical field garment. That's my interpretation of it anyway, in terms of having certainly the integral belt would lend the idea that this is designed to be somewhat smarter than preceding jungle uniforms. There is, of course, also a khaki version of this, which I've previously done a video on, but that's in my older style laid out on the floor. I'll probably do an updated version of that at some point using the mannequin. So there was basically a green and a tan or sand coloured tropical uniform for wear in the desert and the jungle respectively. Airtex bush jacket, drilled trousers, which is the standard British way of doing things at this time. And we'll talk a little bit more about the trousers and so forth as the video progresses. So what we have at the front here are the two breast pockets with a double pleat down the front, and then unpleated lower pockets which just have a flap. There's no button here. They're quite voluminous. They're a good size. The uniform draws on the previous, what collectors refer to as the 1948 pattern, which was an interim Airtex bush jacket and trousers set that was introduced after the 1944 pattern, after the late war jungle uniform. I use the term 1944 pattern. Of course, that specifically refers to the web equipment. The late war jungle equipment is often referred to erroneously by people as the 1944 pattern, so it's kind of a collectorism to use that term, just so you know what I'm talking about. The bush jacket itself draws on that, but as I say, has the addition of an integral waist belt with obviously a brass or perhaps later stay-bright buckle, two-pronged buckle, which is pretty standard for British tropical uniform and is still used, I believe, a stay-bright version. And obviously the RAF used this design as well, but the British Army tropical uniform today, I believe, still uses a stay-bright version of this buckle as a standard sort of waist fastening. The four buttons up the front here, there's no way of closing the collar, so you just have the four button closure down the front there. Obviously the button top pockets, no buttons on the lower pockets, but we do have buttoned epaulets on the shoulder there, as you can see. We'll move this around now and we'll have a look at the left-hand side. On the left side here, you can see, if we lift this up, you can see the waist belt is stitched here, and then there's an integral, it's basically stitched on around the back to draw the back of the garment in. At the cuffs, we have two buttons, which allows a nice large opening, so you can easily roll these up, which was a preference of British soldiers in the tropics. You often see men with their sleeves rolled up. And that's essentially designed there, very, very simple. As I say, made of Airtex, this sort of, I describe it as football shirt material. To American viewers, that might not make much sense. Soccer shirt material. I'm not sure if American football shirts are made of the same sort of material, but this porous, breathable material. So that's the cuffs there, as I say, two buttons, and they do open and roll up very easily, which is a good part of the design. Looking at the back of the uniform here, you can see the stitched in waist belt, and it's a very stylish part of the uniform. It makes it very smart once it's pressed and everything. We've got pleats drawn at the shoulders here, and you can see there's two vents. There's a vent on each side there at the rear, at the skirts there. That's essentially what we'll talk about with the jacket here. There's nothing else to see of any note on the other side. The cuff works in exactly the same way. What we will do now is turn it inside out and have a look at the interior. Here you can see the inside of the uniform, and we don't have any internal pockets, as you can see. Of course, you don't want multiple layers of cloth against the body in tropical environments, ideally. You can see the label down here in the skirts, and we'll get a close-up of that in just a moment. If we turn this round now, we'll have a look at the back of the interior. Looking at the back of the uniform here, you can see we've got pleats drawn in here and here, which draws the garment in around the waist and gives that sort of smarter waisted effect. Perhaps not overly practical for a field garment, but I don't think it really takes anything away. As I say, that's an inside view of the back there. You can see the seam across the shoulders there, and obviously the vents, the interior of the vents there, stitched in at the rear. But that's the inside of the uniform. We'll just get a close-up of the label now for you to have a look at. Here we have the label for the bush jacket, and as you can see, it's labelled Jackets Bush, FCC 15 green, and this is the standard colour chart colour for this colour of jungle green. And then it's labelled 1950 pattern, size number 7, and then you have the size details there, and then it's made by Albion Limited, Belfast in 1957. So, as I say, essentially an upgrade to the previous design, and as I say, the only upgrade I can really see is the waist belt, which is a concession to smartness, which would draw away from it being a practical jungle uniform. So these were quite often modified. Talking about how these were modified, we can see another example here, which has been modified. The waist belt has been removed. It's been cut at each side seam. You can see it's very heavily faded. This one's been there and back. Presumably it's had epaulets, it's had rank slides or something on at some point, because the epaulets are not faded here, where you'd normally expect the sun to get at them if it's being worn out of the shade of the jungle. So they're still quite a nice dark green, so I can only assume that rank slides were being worn at some point on the shoulders. But this is an example of what they look like after they've been heavily worn and beaten up, and it's a good example from that point of view for wearing. For my purposes, it looks like it's been there and back, and as I say, the removal of the waist belt does make it a somewhat more practical garment, especially as British soldiers like to tuck these in and essentially wear them as shirts, ignoring the lower pockets. Very common for British troops to do. So there we go, this is an example of one that's had the waist belt removed. I'll just show you the side of it now so you can see where the waist belt's been removed. Looking at the side of the uniform here, you can see the side seam where the belt would originally have come loose to be buckled around the front, but the belt has been removed all the way around the back here. The entire waist belt, including where it was fixed to the rear of the uniform, has all been removed, which removes that extra layer of cloth over the kidneys and the back of the hips here, which obviously means you've got a little bit less stuff there to soak up sweat and so forth, with a little bit better ventilation. But that's all been removed there. So just one of the ways these were modified for use in the field. We'll talk about the trousers now. Talking about things being starched, these have been quite heavily starched at some point in the life. You can probably see the shine of the light on there. In terms of the design of the layout of the pockets and so forth, we have a single leg pocket on the side of the leg here. We have slash pockets in the hip, in each hip here, and then we have a rear pocket there, and there's another rear pocket on the other side. Obviously the other slash pocket on the side there. These are essentially jungle green drill, they're slightly tapered, but quite a wide opening at the ankle there. And they famously have the double buckle fastening at the waist. Now the way this operates is you have a slot here, and one side of the strap passes through that, which I'll just demonstrate now if I can. There we go. And you fasten the waist together like that. Obviously you have a button fly in there as well, but your waist fastens like that. And then you have a buckle on each side, as you can see, which the strap buckles through. Now this makes some logical sense. It's fiddly to do, but with these different holes you can draw the waist in evenly on each side. So as you lose weight in the jungle, which obviously that was part of British thinking, men who'd been on prolonged jungle operations during the Second World War lost a lot of weight. It means they can still be worn relatively comfortably because you're drawing the waist in on each side rather than just pinching it in at the front of the waist. So quite an effective design from that point of view, though it is fiddly. And this would remain, obviously the Australians would copy this for their jungle uniform and their greens. And as I say, it was used on SAS windproof trousers as well. So as I say, quite an emblematic part of British uniform or Commonwealth uniform, and quite an unusual one. The Royal Navy would also copy this for one of their designs of number 8 trousers as well. You can see the pleats in the front here, quite heavily pleated, is typical for uniform of this time. Pleats coming down here, 2 on each side, and then as I say, we can see the buttoned fly there at the front, as you can see, again battle dress type buttons. We'll turn these inside out now as well and have a quick look at these. Looking at the front of the inside of these, you can see here the pockets, the internal pockets, the inside of the fly there, obviously concealed button fly. We turn it round, you can see here at the top the label in the waistband there, and the inside of the 2 rear pockets there. But otherwise a fairly plain design, good design. The drill uniform, they're tough enough. and they're a good colour at this point. Of course, British Army having introduced the jungle green uniform during the Second World War. They're not a bad design for the time period. Of course, by the 70s, they're probably getting a bit long in the tooth in terms of design, but they would be worn right the way through into the 70s. Here you can see these trousers were made by Aquarock, and again, we have trousers drill and the colour code SCC15, green, 1950 pattern, and again, these are size number 7, and you have the height details, the size details, excuse me, down below. As already discussed, there was an interim uniform introduced, which I believe is referred to as the 1956 pattern. The trousers essentially remained the same. The jacket tried to make a concession to more practicality. The buttons were removable for laundering, similar to denim buttons, and the waist belt was also removable. I don't have an example of one of those, so when I do find one, that will be a topic for a future video, or perhaps if one of my friends, such as Alan Pryor, who has an excellent collection of jungle uniform, may be able to lend me one, or we can film at his place perhaps. We'll talk about that in more detail further on. One thing I will talk about though is the later iteration of these trousers, which we'll have a look at now. Essentially the same but labelled differently, slightly different colour as well. We'll talk about those now. Okay, so here we have the later iteration of the trousers. These are exactly the same pattern essentially, and these would be worn through into the 1980s. They're referred to as trousers OD. By this point, they've lost the 1950 pattern nomenclature, but as I say, the pattern itself is pretty much the same. Leg pocket on the side here, slash pocket there, rear pocket, another rear pocket, and then the slash pocket on this side as well. And obviously you have the buckles here for the waist fastening, which is exactly the same. It's the design with 2 straps. The labelling is different. We'll have a close-up look at the label in just a minute, but they're now trousers men's olive drab. They're no longer referred to as 1950 pattern, but the design is essentially exactly the same, as you can see, hopefully looking at them there. I raise my arm out of the way so you can actually see the buckle adjustment there. We'll have a close-up look at the label now, which shows the different nomenclature. Here you can see the label on the trousers showing the different nomenclature, and they're now labelled trousers men's olive drab, below which you have the NATO stock number and the size, which is size 5, and then we've F. Fryer and Company Limited, and the contract number underneath that dates these to around the 1970s, the mid-1970s, and then you have the washing instructions to the right. So there we are. That was a look at the British Army's 1950 pattern jungle green uniform, the AirTech bush jacket and the drill trousers from that set. As I say, the khaki version of this we'll have a look at in the future. Tan khaki. As I say, they're essentially the desert version of the uniform. That will be something I'll do an updated video on, looking on the mannequin at some point. Similarly long-lived, and in fact the last sort of standard issue British Army desert uniform before the Desert DPM was introduced in the late 80s, so quite interesting. The tropical combats, of course, being actually worn in desert environments in the interim. That's a topic for another video. I hope you found this interesting, as I always say. Thank you very much to those who've supported on Patreon. Soon you'll be seeing a slight change in videos, hopefully, because the money from that I'm going to be putting towards getting some new editing software. And thank you also to those who support me on PayPal. That's also been a very big contribution towards that as well. Potentially a new camera as well. We'll see how that goes. If you like the content, if you like the videos, then please do consider subscribing if you haven't already. Obviously there's the little notification button as well down below, the little bell. If you hit that, you'll be notified obviously of when I upload future videos. There's also the Facebook and the Instagram page. On both of those I will post photographs of the collection, reenacting events and so forth, and the mannequin of the month. Photographs get posted up there as well if you want to take a closer look at those. But that's everything for this video, so until next time, bye for now.